Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're with us today. Today, we're going to be talking with Dr. Jyothi Robertson. And Dr. Robertson has been a hero of mine for a long time. And one of the benefits of the pandemic, if we can actually think of that in a positive way, has been the way in which our two worlds have collided and caused us to start working together on some projects. And that has been just such a huge blessing, if you will, for me to just be associated with Dr. Robertson beyond just knowing who she is and the amazing work that she has done. And she is kind of an amazing individual. Dr. Robertson has been an anthropologist, a third grade teacher, a microbiologist, and a veterinarian. I think she's probably invented the 48-hour day in order to get all of this done at such a relatively young age. And we are so excited to have her here today. In addition to the work that she does through her consulting group, she's also done a lot of pro bono work for Human Animal Support Services, the AVMA Animal Welfare Committee, the CVMA Animal Welfare Committee, Heirs to the Ocean, The Journey You Own, and her work with ADISA. So this is clearly an individual who has worn many, many hats. And today is an opportunity for all of us to get to know Dr. Robertson a little better and to ask her questions about DEI issues that are important to all of us. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. But first, we sat down with Dr. Robertson a few weeks ago to talk about her unique perspective on animal welfare and how we can make our field and our world a better place by opening our awareness and our actions to other social movements. So let's have a look.
My name is Jyothi Robertson, and I am a shelter medicine consultant for JVR Shelter Strategies, and am also with The Journey You Own and an advisor for ADISA. To give you a little history about myself, I started out as an anthropologist, went to education, a molecular biologist, and eventually ended up becoming a veterinarian in private practice. And the private practice was next door to an animal shelter. So I started working with that shelter and really fell in love with it. And at that time in my life, I actually found out about a rare congenital heart disorder that I have. And so decided to leave my job in private practice, call up Dr. Kate Hurley at UC Davis at the Crash Shelter Medicine program and start a residency. And pretty much the rest is history, because I decided to go into shelter medicine, start my own consulting business, really to impact the largest number of animals and help as many pets as I could in as short a time frame as feasible with the type of lifestyle I wanted, to be able to travel, live with my family, and really visit shelters throughout the world. One of the things that I have faced repeatedly in animal sheltering is a form of discrimination that's surprised me, I think, in that my last name is Robertson, right? So I have a very American white last name. And when people hire me or when they bring me into shelters to talk to other people, they often know who I am already. I've spoken with them, but their communities and other people in city councils or boards, commissioners, county commissioners, others do not. So they have an expectation of who I am before I show up. And when I do show up, I can often be dismissed initially because they're not expecting a 5-foot-tall Indian woman. They're expecting whatever Robertson is in their mind. And I've noticed that I have had to work like 10 times as hard sometimes to get their respect in a way that perhaps if I looked like a Robertson, that I may not have felt that. And for that matter, there have been situations where I've come in with engineers and architects and other project development folks where they have specifically asked, like, who am I and why am I there, and how I have the ability to speak to specific topics. And I don't think that if my husband had walked in, and he also is Dr. Robertson, that he would have had that same treatment that I've gotten. It's something that I know that many Southeast Asians feel. And again, English, is actually not my first language, and nor my second, but I have worked really hard to sound American and take on American English mannerisms and be that to fit in. And now I'm at a point where I'm trying to understand, well, why have I done that? And what does it look like to be authentic to who I am, as an Indian woman in this space of animal sheltering?
A thing for orientation for camp counselors. I spelled counselors wrong in my computer over here.
I have been very interested in social justice, climate change, animal welfare, and education reform for a while now. And for that reason, I have been looking at how these systems play with each other, how people within these different areas are conducting amazing research, doing incredible programs, and are sharing that knowledge with others in their own fields, and perhaps not bringing that to the area of animal welfare. So a part of what I've been trying to do is bring some of those new conversations around some of these other areas into animal welfare. And I believe that there is a lot of intersection, between these different fields. I'll give you an example: climate change and animal welfare. So in climate change, I'm interested in oceans, and I've had the great privilege of being part of an organization called Ayerstar Oceans. That's a youth empowerment advocacy group that was started by friends of mine that's now international, where youth are working together in Pacific Islands, throughout the world and all the continents, to bring fresh water, to care for the oceans, to care for beings in the oceans, so marine life and fish and others. So what does it look like for us in animal welfare with companion animals, so in animal sheltering, to start being aware of this work that's being done over here in the ocean space? And the ways that that might present itself could be by thinking about our own utilization of water, how we think about plastic and plastic pollution and things like that. So this idea of intersectionality means looking at problems from that DEI lens, right? Because these are all diversity, equity, inclusion considerations when we talk about water, when we talk about animal welfare, taking that lens to look at some of the major problems that are happening in the world right now. In some ways, animal welfare has been in a silo for a very long time, in that we are so focused on the tremendous number of problems that we have in our industry. Homeless pets, free roaming pets, access to veterinary care. Some of these issues have been coming up in different ways over the course of the past few years, and more so even now in this past year, when we've all been in this type of a Zoom style setting. And I believe that this is really an opportune time for us to move out of our realm of our individual shelters, where we're really looking at intake numbers, outcome numbers, adoptions, transfers, things like that, and taking a step back and really looking at, why are those numbers the numbers that they are? What has led to having so many owner surrenders, let's say, in a particular community? Why are relinquishment rates that way? And can we now turn to the human aspect of that and look within society and say, okay, are there underlying factors that have been based on systems and structural systems that have led to these type of problems that we're seeing within the confines of sheltering?
Today's episode explores the important connection between caring for animals and building strong communities. We're talking about
I think that the first step is participating in conversations like this and being comfortable with being uncomfortable, having the conversation with other people about, well, what is it that you did at your shelter, and how are you thinking about owner surrenders, and how are you viewing your community engagement program? And I think Haas and other programs like that, or movements like that, offer an opportunity for that type of conversation. One of the things that I started last year during COVID, right at the beginning, was based on work by Ruth King. And Ruth King is an incredible activist and advocate, and she's also a Buddhist Black lesbian leader who has been a proponent of racial affinity groups and this idea of working within your race to do just some of those conversations that perhaps can be in that safe space. So, excuse me, what I did was I brought together people from animal welfare who are Indian, and I didn't know them. And this was back in March, or it was actually before George Floyd's murder. So it was earlier in the year. And I brought them together, and now we meet every month, a group of Indian women who are in animal welfare, to have some of these conversations in a safe space where we can work on animal welfare and how it looks for Indians within our culture. So that's just one example. That's a small example of how to create, those spaces for conversations and at different stages of where people are at and meeting them where they're at. I encourage everyone who's listening to really examine themselves and, be bold, be okay with having conversations and thinking about DEI and really examining yourself and thinking about your own bias and where you play a role in DEI and how you can be a part of these conversations and not be afraid to have the conversation.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. I feel so honored to be able to take the next couple minutes to talk more about some of the issues you raised. And I really would like to start off by talking a little bit more about the biases that we have. Before we started today, you had a great example of implicit bias, and I would love it for you to share it with all of us.
Yes. Hi, Mary. Thank you for inviting me to be here. So it's really great to have this opportunity. What I was talking to you about before this conversation was really what bias can look like. And I wanted to give an example. Many of you probably know me from veterinary medicine or sheltering and other locations. So when I show up like this, people are really comfortable with me usually, and because I look like all of you. And just yesterday, my daughter was using the same computer and was dancing Bharatanatyam, which is a traditional form of Indian dance. And she left her bindi right here. And what I was showing Mary is that when I put this dot on my head, it changes the way that people relate to me, right? And you may have felt it too. Like right now, you might have felt tightening or something. You might not have. But for a lot of people, if I was to come into a sheltering, let's say consultation, or even as an adopter, and I have this red dot on my hair pulled back where I'm looking more traditional Indian, that all of a sudden creates distance, and it makes it harder. What I've heard is that I'm no longer relatable. And so, an underlying assumption and implicit bias that happens is that I no longer can relate to the person, and that I might not relate to animals in the same way that that you might. And all of that happened simply by literally sticking a red dot on my forehead. And so when Mary and I were talking about this before this call, we were, just commenting about how, this happens all the time, not just for Indians, but in all of our societies, what we're comfortable with and the people that we're used to, we have certain images of what that looks like, right? So if I, again, take this off, my hair is down, I look Western, I'm suddenly relatable. Everybody understands who I am. So I think that that's just an example of implicit bias. And there's tests that are out there. Kara has a great one with Harvard's Project Implicit that was really eye-opening for me to look at. And so that's my lovely example.
And what I love about that is the idea that it's not really about the objective is not to be bias free. The objective, in my opinion, is to have that understanding of where my biases are. And not all biases are bad. Biases stem from, preference and taste and experience and all of these, sort of non-pejorative type of experiences. And it's figuring out, being aware of when those come into play and how we make decisions. And it's just been such a, I think, a journey that we're all on as a result of the pandemic, which in its own way has created a sense of confinement for all of us that we, experience through the animals in our care on a daily basis. And so you talked in the video about how animal welfare can be siloed. And could you just elaborate a little bit more on that? Because I think that's kind of why we're all here today.
Yeah, and so it's not just animal welfare. It really is all of us in passionate professions where we start working so much with whatever it is we're doing, whether it's animals, climate change, social justice issues. And when we're doing that work, we tend to focus in on that work. And what's happened, at least in my life, is I realized that I was compartmentalizing those aspects of my life that I'm doing outside, which actually could be really helping some of the conversations in animal welfare. So as an example, in the video, it pointed out the Journey You Own and Ayerstar Oceans. So Journey You Own has environmental crisis, education reform, and social justice as three key pillars that actually influence animal welfare. So what does it look like for us to design shelters that actually have us thinking about our carbon footprint? Okay. Or that maybe are using gray water instead of fresh water? What does it look like for us to think about environmental racism, which is that aspect where marginalized communities are at greater proportion going to be feeling the impacts of toxic waste, industrial waste, everything that's happening in our environment because of all of the systems that have led to the inequities that we have. So when we just work within animal welfare and we don't look outside of animal welfare at some of the solutions that are happening outside, I think we're doing animal welfare a disservice. There are other fields that have really had done an incredible job of both igniting and engaging with communities in other cultures and other nations that we could look at and maybe model from. And so that's, that's part of that silo effect. And I think that that's normal for all of us to have that because it's our comfort zone of sorts. And so what does it look like to move outside of our comfort zone?
So here we are on the anniversary of the George Floyd murder. It's been a year. And we've talked a lot in animal welfare about diversity, equity, inclusion. We use that shorthand DEI. And I worry a little bit that in shortening it, we've lost the power of what those three words actually mean and how they come together under the umbrella of social justice. But if you were looking in your crystal ball and could imagine, what would that look like? What would animal welfare look like through a lens of social justice?
What I'm hearing is sort of a question around what does success look like if you think about animal welfare through social justice. Am I correct
Yes.
in asking that in that way? So I think it needs to be looked at both an individual level and a community level. On the individual level, it means that people are showing up authentically and are participating in engaging conversations fully. So that means that everyone who shows up feels like they can fully belong. So when you look at DEI, there's that diversity aspect, which is who's showing up, right? But there's also that inclusion component, and there's that sense of belonging. And I like to add in the authenticity component. So it's not just feeling like you're part of the team, but it's being able to engage in a way that maybe you disagree, and it's okay to disagree, and that shows up openly and honestly. So that speaks to the individual level. At the community level, really it means what I could see is that animal welfare is now thinking about itself in relation to all these other systems, right? And the structures. So what does it look like to actually have the people who live in the community, if they're let's say we're in an underserved community, our underrepresented community, that the people from the community are actually part of the system of change of the organization. But then beyond the animal welfare component, that we're actually finding out what are the other issues in their lives. Okay, like here in the Bay Area, if we're talking about Pescadero, there's been, people haven't been able to drink from the taps in certain areas because of the groundwater's gotten polluted from fertilizer and from other runoffs and so on. So what does it look like to find out, well, what else is happening in their lives that we as animal welfare professionals are being able to engage with them in a way that now we're creating justice, right? And equity, because we're actually addressing the underlying systems and problems that led to what we see as stray animals, as owner relinquishments, right? We're seeing the after effects of all these other systems that have led to those problems occurring. And so that's sort of that tip of the iceberg kind of component that, if we are thinking about ourselves as and what's happening within the confines of our animal shelters as being part of this discussion, that's at the top, well, what are the systems that led to that? So success would look like having community members engaging in actually talking about what else is impacting them and how can we change some of those systems. It could look like legislation, it could look like policy change. It very importantly involves youth and that next generation, right? Whether it be veterinary students, college students, high school students, advocates and policymakers, and really being able to bring them on board to making some of the change that impacts their lives as well.
So Catherine Chenier was asking, what are some of the tangible ways white allies can do to help? For example, what would you have appreciated during some of your personal experiences of bias and discrimination?
Well, I think I'd appreciate if people actually said something, and when it was really obvious. And I did have people that at least in one occasion, very forcefully stood up and supported the bias that they see. And I envision that this happens to many other people as well, who are minority races or BIPOC and others as well, that a part of being an ally is not being afraid to stand up when it gets super uncomfortable, right? So it's one thing to stand up later on, but when it's actually happening, that's what bullying is, right? And so we think about, again, I go back to education all the time because I worked with youth so much. So in the high school programs that, that we're working with, I think it's the same idea of really elevating voices and being comfortable with elevating them. And as far as very specific things that shelters can do or allies can do, I think a part of it is doing the work. So the video mentioned Ruth King, and a part of Ruth King's work involves having affinity groups that are allies, right? And that work needs to also happen themselves, that there can't be an expectation that your BIPOC friends are the ones that are driving these conversations. Part of the work needs to happen yourself. And so what does it look like to create safe spaces for that to happen as well? And again, I'm going to take it back to youth again. I think it's very important to be doing that at young age where these conversations are happening. So the example I'm going to give you here is locally, I work with an animal shelter here called Pets in Need, which you also saw in the video, and the Teen Ambassador program. And they work with a high school called Design Tech High School, which is a public high school here in San Mateo County that has youth that are, the whole curriculum is based on an anti-racism curriculum. And so as part of their curriculum next year, they're putting in a whole intercession program where Pets in Need and I will be teaching high school students throughout the year in 3 different sessions about anti-racism, about social justice, about animal welfare, about how to engage in our communities, how to engage with our cats and dogs, our own animals and each other. And so that's another example of where allies, are coming up, where we are now engaging in ways that we can bring youth from, again, marginalized, underrepresented communities with youth that are more privileged. And let's bring them together so that they can start having these conversations at a young age. So by the time they get to the place where we are, they've already established some understanding and are advocates and are changing policy. So that's a long answer, Catherine.
But it was
a short question. I realize that.
But it was a great answer. And Jyothi, thank you so much for being here today. It really has meant, I think, so much for us. And for all of us who want to continue to have this discussion with Jyothi, we can go to Maddie's Pet Forum. Allison has posted a link in the chat file. And Jyothi will be here for about an hour more on the forum and then for the rest of the week. So if you have questions or comments, please feel free to use the forum to communicate. It's really a safe place. No one will monetize any of your data or use it in inappropriate ways. So Jyothi, thank you again. And thank you all for spending your lunch hour with us.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.